Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In the 21st century, we will see the end of the era of Western domination of world history, a return to success of many Asian societies, and a small, densely interconnected global village. This is the idea put forward by Professor Kishore Mahbubani in his new book, The Asian 21st Century. As a former senior diplomat of Singapore and a renowned scholar of geopolitics, Mahbubani offers a comprehensive and in-depth study of the global dynamics and challenges, as well as concrete solutions for restoring international governance. To explore the topics of his new book, we are honored to have Professor Kishore Mahbubani on the show. We'll be joined in the discussion by Wang Huiyao, President of the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So, Huiyao, I will start with you. Tell us about your plan to introduce, distinguished scholars to the Chinese circle, in particular to the Chinese readership.
This Professor Mahbubani's new book, Asian 21st Century, is really a new book that has collected all the essays and the speeches that Professor Mahbubani actually done in recent years. It's such a great book. We have just launched this book with the world-renowned publisher, Spring Nature. And so we had a number of international experts and also Chinese experts actually discussed in this book in great length. And we have been very much stimulated by this Professor Mahbubani's new book, which is talk about Asia in the 21st century. And we have actually just has this RCEP started January 1st this year, but also we're having Olympic is coming up, Winter Olympics. So in between, we have this new book launch with the international, well-known international publisher, Spring Nature, is such a, I think, a great, important event. Because in this book, Professor Mahbubani talked about, the Western dominance is diminishing, somewhat, but also the return of Asia, the peaceful rise of China, how to safeguard multilateralism and globalization forward.
Yes. Professor Mahbubani, it's an honor to have you to talk about your book, in which you mentioned some interesting idea. For example, you said, the era of Western domination is coming to the end in the 21st century. I wonder, how do you draw that conclusion?
Well, it's very simple. It's statistics. I'll give you an example. In the year 1950, this is, not so long ago, 72 years ago, the United States share of the global GNP was alone over 50%. And China and India, even though they are the world's largest population, their combined share of the GNP was less than 5%. But now, as you know, the United States share has shrunk to 25%, and China's and India's share has grown significantly. And today, if you look at purchasing power parity terms, the four largest economies in the world are number one, China, number two, United States, number three, India, number four, Japan. So three out of the four largest economies of the world are already Asian. And all these statistics show that the era of Western domination of world history that began maybe about 200 years ago in 1820 is finally coming to an end. And I hope that my book gives insights into how this happened, why this happened, and why Asia is returning, and why the 21st century will be the Asian century.
Mm-hmm. Interesting idea. How do you think this idea is being accepted in the Western world, say?
Well, I would say the response of the Western world is mixed. The more thoughtful intellectuals, those who understand history, know that the return of Asia is the most significant thing that is happening in human history. So I give you an example. The former president of Harvard, Professor Larry Summers, when he gave me an endorsement for one of my earlier books, The New Asian Hemisphere, said that the return of Asia is the biggest story of contemporary history and will dwarf all other stories. So people like him understand and accept that. But of course, there are what I call the liberal intellectuals who find it hard to believe that the West will no longer be dominant and that non-Westernized societies will succeed and do well. There is a lot of resistance from the liberal intellectuals. So even within the West, there is a struggle to come to terms with the return of Asia.
Well, speak of these intellectuals, you also mentioned in your book the idea that when it comes to the thinking of the American society, you describe that as an open society with closed minds, in particular the liberals. But usually when you say someone is a liberal, we equal that to being open-minded, to new ideas, to different ideas. I mean, why you are seeing a closed mind here?
Well, this is exactly the great paradox of our time. Because in many ways, the liberal intellectuals have contributed a lot to human history, to opening up our minds. And paradoxically, I was a student of Western philosophy as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate student. And so I understand the power of liberal ideas. They're great ideas. But what is strange is that those who consider themselves the descendants of the liberal intellectual tradition of the West, I find are among those who are the most resistant to accepting the idea that there can be other societies choosing other forms of governance and other forms of social contracts in their societies. So this is what my book tries to do, to try and explain to these liberal intellectuals, be prepared for a world where there'll be different civilizations succeeding, and the different civilizations will come back according to their own civilizational norms and not Western norms. So it is of course still a struggle to convince the liberal intellectuals of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, Huio, I wonder, I mean, you have been in close contact with intellectuals from around the world, including intellectuals from the US and other European countries. Do you have similar experience or similar impression about them?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Kishore just said. I think that we are actually in unprecedented changes taking place throughout the world, and the globalization is really at its crossroad. And then, so the intellectual world, I mean, given the background, given the country they live in, given the also the Western domination, as Kishore said, in the last 200 years, and also all the narratives, all the media dominance they have. So there is some bias, or maybe their perspective. So I think now China has been, and Asia to that matter, ASEAN, for example. I remember well a few years back, Professor Mahbubani, another book, about ASEAN, which published as well. The Chinese edition was launched at the Peking University. I was at the lab launch as well. So you see the Asian rise and China rise was only in the last 10, 20 years, maximum 30 years. So there's a lot of adjustment, a lot of recognition and perception, and of course, finally acceptance. This process is still going on. I mean, in between, there's a lot of course, disagreement, a lot of argument, even bias against these newly rising countries. So I think that takes time, and I believe that that's why I think we need the scholars like Kishore Mahbubani, which I think take a very unique position. And neither he's the Chinese or Westerner, but he actually from ASEAN and has a very unique perspective. Yet it is a globalist that look at this issue that can provide us a very, I would say, very neutral but very stimulating ideas for us to all think about, for us to really consider. So I think intellectual world should welcome the books that Kishore has been publishing, and then it's also to rise some, all those debates as well. So we really appreciate what Kishore has contributed to this intellectual debate.
Professor Mahbubani, in your book, you shared with your readers about your observation about the United States, in particular, some of the problems or challenges, I would say. One of them, you would say, Americans are not happy because of money politics. For example, the U.S. is no longer providing a fair, competitive environment for the rich and the poor, so they can make it. In a sense, do you think the American dream somehow is not alive anymore?
Well, I would say that the American dream has been badly damaged. And I believe in my book, I have an essay on how America has become a plutocracy. And of course, a plutocracy is the opposite of a democracy. A democracy is a government by the people, for the people, of the people. But unfortunately, plutocracy is a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And if you look statistically, the average income of the bottom 50% hasn't gone up for 30 years in the United States, which is quite shocking. That's a shocking statistic. Whereas those at the top 1% have seen a tremendous exponential growth in their wealth. And of course, this is a result of a rather unwise decision of the Supreme Court to allow corporations and unions to use unlimited amount of money in politics. And as you yourself said, when you get money into politics, then you distort the political system. You don't get, in a sense, one person, one vote. You get $1, one vote. And that's very dangerous. So actually, my book, therefore, my essays are an effort to help the United States fight the plutocracy that is damaging the United States. And unfortunately, I'm not the only one saying that the United States is a plutocracy. The late Paul Volcker, the head of the Fed, said the United States is a plutocracy. The Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz says that the United States is a plutocracy. And the Financial Times columnist Martin Wolf also says that the United States is a plutocracy. So it is a serious problem in the United States, and it's in the American interest to deal with it squarely.
Well, for Americans, of course, they would say, democracy is well alive. But then you would ask the question, is the democracy itself enough without, for example, creating this fair competition environment or improving the living standard of the people, in particular those, the less half of the population. You mentioned in your book, from 1980 to 2020, the 30 years time, their living standard or their income actually remained unchanged. What went wrong?
I would say, one thing that has gone wrong is that the traditional Western philosophers, I'm talking about Locke, Bentham, even Adam Smith, Hobbes and all that, whenever traditional Western philosophers talk about the great goals of the society, they spoke of freedom and they spoke of equality. Two concepts, freedom, equality. Equality means that you also try and take care of people at the bottom of society and not just people at the very top. But what's happened in recent years is that in the United States, they only focus on freedom and not on equality. And that's created a lack of balance in their policies. And so the net result is that there is a lack of concern for the poor. And by the way, I want to emphasize, as I say in my essay on plutocracy, the greatest recent American philosopher was John Rawls, who wrote a book, A Theory of Justice. And John Rawls was the one who also emphasized you must ask for freedom and you must ask for equality, meaning you must also take care of the poor. And that second part of the taking care of the poor, pushing for equality, that half has died in the United States, and that's why it's become a plutocracy.
Well, frankly speaking, these problems or challenges for the U.S. society, U.S. system has been there for some time, even not completely accepted or or acknowledged by the country. But anyway, do you think the U.S. itself is able to correct those issues or fix those problems? In particular, for example, for the past couple of years, with this pandemic, COVID pandemic, you see the latest number, of course, you see the 1 trillion increase in the wealth for the rich and the super rich, but not for the regular folks.
Well, I think that this is going to be, in my view, the existential challenge for the United States. It cannot be fixed overnight. It's a very deeply seated problem. But it's either, but if before you can solve a problem, you must first of all acknowledge that there's a problem. If you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, how can you solve it? And there's still a reluctance on the part of American intellectuals to say, hey, that we have a real problem with plutocracy. I was just reading the latest issue of the magazine Foreign Policy, which is one of the best magazines in the United States, and they have 10 essays on what's gone wrong with American democracy. But I was surprised that in those essays, they don't discuss the challenge of plutocracy. So this is why I think it's important for Americans to first of all accept that it has become a plutocracy, and then you can fix it. But if you resist that idea, then I'm afraid the solution will not come soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your book, you also talked about human rights, the practice of human rights. You mentioned about, you criticized actually the practice of double standards. When it comes to the U.S. human rights issue, there's another different reaction, probably different response. But from the issues of other countries, tell us more about that.
Well, I think it's very good to have a universal declaration of human rights. It's very good that we have succeeded in promoting human rights and making them more universalized over the last 30, 40, 50 years. But of course, what the problem is that when countries use human rights as a foreign policy tool, then you get double standards. And for example, for many years, the United States used to criticize the practice of torture in many countries. And it was right for the United States to criticize torture. But then surprisingly, after 9/11 and after the American invasion of Iraq, when the United States set up Guantanamo, the United States began to practice torture. So I've consistently said that that's double standards. If you criticize other countries, you must criticize yourself also. And in the case of the European countries have criticized the poorer countries which practice torture, but they never criticize the United States government for practicing torture. That's double standards. And I think I'm doing this, I'm making these criticisms with the way of helping the Europeans and helping the United States to become more consistent in what they are doing and to stand by their own standards.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the human rights issue, if you look at it, in particular between China and the U.S., is one of the very controversial issue, a topic, let's say. And of course, criticism of human rights practice is one thing, but weaponizing human rights against other party or another country is probably even, I would say, more serious issue here.
Absolutely. I think that, this also goes back to probably, there's a different development stages. There's also goes to the different culture and philosophical background. For example, in China, there's a Chinese saying that people, the food is the sky for the people. There's a Chinese saying, 民以食为天, food is the sky for the people. So for China, with 1.4 billion people, you have the development, you have the enough food, you have the abundant food, you have a good quality food to really feed 1.4 billion people. That's the, I think, biggest achievement of human right in the history of mankind. And then reduction of 800 million people out of poverty, lifting 70% of global poverty reduction is also the biggest contribution China can make to the world. So I think that is really how human rights can be interpreted as well. On top of the freedom and other human rights as well. But I think, going back a bit to the question raised to, Professor Mahbubani on the this plutocracy that we are seeing. Exactly. I mean, we see this 1% of Wall Street, their wealth is getting bigger and bigger, and even during the pandemic time, they are still getting very big increase. Whereas the 40-50% of the mass population, they are not getting increase for decades.
Professor Mahbubani, Huyao made a very interesting ideas about broadening these indicators, to measure the performance of a particular country. And also he mentioned about democracy. Remember, not long ago, President Biden organized a democracy summit. Do you think that's enough to somehow fix the U.S. problem or change the U.S., let's say, U.S. image globally or impression about the United States?
Well, I think it's, the hardest thing for a Western mind to accept is the reality, and this is the first point that we discussed, you and I, that the era of Western domination of world history is over. And the era of domination of Western ideas is also over. So when the West, when President Joe Biden and his administration organizes a summit on democracies and invites some countries and disinvites other countries, an idea like that is dividing the world. It is not uniting the world. What you need to do, and this is paradoxically, this is the great paradox, okay? The spirit of democracy is about accepting diversity, about accepting different points of view. Now, in the 21st century, we are going to go away from the 19th and 20th century where you had one dominant civilization to having many successful civilizations with their own culture, their own traditions, their own social contracts, their own values, their own norms. So if you really want to be democratic in spirit in the 21st century, what you have to do is accept diversity. And therefore, don't invite people to a conference who agree with you. You invite people to the conference who disagree with you. That's what the spirit of democracy is all about. And therefore, this summit on democracy, paradoxically, which is an attempt to unite the world, actually divides the world and pushes us back to the 19th and 20th centuries. We now must move forward and live in a world of greater diversity and work with the UN. And for example, the UN has launched the idea of dialogue among civilizations. That is a much more democratic institution than a summit of democracies.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting point there. Obviously, it's reasonable to talk to people with different ideas. Speak of this dividedness, globally. One of the most important relationship is between China and the United States. The rise of China, and then the existing power, the United States, the superpower here. You mentioned in your book about the West should accept or accommodate the rise of China. But then there is a structural issue. People would say, as an existing superpower, the U.S. would do probably whatever it can to somehow maintain its global dominance, its preeminence, and then in that process probably to slow the rise of China or sometimes or sabotage the rise of China. How should China respond, or how the two countries cope with each other?
Well, unfortunately, that's what my book Has China Won is about. As you can see, I have the Chinese edition also behind me, which Dr. Wang Weihao and the Center for China and Globalization translated the Chinese. And the whole US-China geopolitical contest, which will be the defining geopolitical contest over the next 10 to 20 years, is a very complex issue and has many dimensions to it. And by the same time, the key dimension is completely predictable. Because for 2,000 years of human history, no number one power gracefully says, hey, it's no longer my turn to be number one, I'll become number two. So when the United States is trying so hard to remain number one, That's normal behavior on the part of the United States. But of course, the United States should also be wise and ask itself a simple question: can you stop the return of China? And if you cannot stop it, why not learn to live with it and work out a win-win arrangement between the United States and China? And that's the goal of my book, to try and persuade the United States that stop trying to, prevent the return of China. It cannot succeed. Work out a more intelligent long-term strategy and find a strategy which will benefit the American people and benefit the Chinese people. And I think that can be done. So I think all of us in the rest of the world should help the United States and China reach a new modus vivendi instead of going headlong into an all-out geopolitical contest, which will be bad for the two countries and bad for the world.
For the rest of the world, when they are looking at China, U.S., this geopolitical competition, they are not standing there idle, being forced to choose a side. They can take some initiative and make their own choice, say stay in the middle and persuade the two countries to slow down, to back off from this competition. Is that the case?
Well, I think, in my view, I would love to hear Wang Weiyao's views. I think more and more countries are quietly telling both China and the US that, frankly, it's better for you to tone down your contests and find ways and means of cooperating. And if you want me to end with a piece of good news, as you know, when the Biden administration came in, its policies on China were exactly the same as the Trump administration. There was no difference at all, and there was a rather acrimonious meeting in Alaska, as you know, in 2021. But the good news is that I think the Biden administration quietly has begun to realize that these policies of constant, ceaseless confrontation with China is not necessarily wise. And my sense is that now the Biden administration is going to be more careful going forward and hopefully be a bit less confrontational and a bit more consensual in dealing with China.
So Huiyao, what's your take?
Yeah, I think to conclude, just to say that President Xi and President Biden, their virtual summit just a month or so ago, President Biden said they're not seeking changing China and not seeking a set of alliance against China. So we hope that we have that understanding, and U.S. has no interest against the U.S. as well. China has no interest against the U.S. as well. And if we really reach that, consensus by two leaders, I hope that we can really put that into practice. That's really what we are hoping for. And I hope that if U.S. and China can work together, we will have a much better world for tomorrow. And also if EU, ASEAN, and many other countries can really, go between and then be bridges and mediator for the two biggest economy, we're going to have a very better future for tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mahbubani and Dr. Wang Huiyao. That's it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.